I'm going to start off with a question of my own. Okay, and let me motivate it along the following way. I think previous discussions of the Irish pension system would have said that it worked very well along two dimensions. And the first one was because basically the contributory, non-contributory pension was sort of set at a level that just about kept people out of poverty. That part of the system did well in alleviating poverty. And then because we provided tax incentives to people to invest in their private pension and to have that earnings related link, that policy, looked after the sort of the replacement rate bit. So I know you sort of conceptually teed everything up in terms of these various, poverty benchmarks versus replacement rate. But could you say that the system has currently designed actually does address those two issues? Now, of course, subject to various inadequacies, but is the basic design of the system right?
Yep. So I'll make a start on that. So yeah, you're right, Alan. I suppose the policy targets have tended to focus on the replacement rate issue, but there's obviously a big policy focus on income poverty as well. So I think the issue, I think, is around people that are not in the very lowest end of the distribution. So, people who have very low incomes, the state pension does a really good job, obviously, of replacing their incomes. And provided that they get the full rate of the state pension, it's enough to keep them out of income poverty. But I suppose it's people who are slightly above that, who won't have coverage for example, occupational pension coverage or private pension coverage, and or people who don't have entitlements to the full rate of the state pension. And they're the people that obviously fall into income poverty and that we're still worried about. So I think, on balance, it does work well, but I think there are people who can slip through the gaps. I think that's, where I suppose the system needs to work better.
Yeah. Hey, Barrett, did you want to add on to that at all?
Yeah, so maybe just on that. So I think what maybe comes out, I think what you're saying is correct, that the state pension does, in general, at the level that it's set in particular, for most people, will keep them out of poverty and will will ensure that. But really, maybe there's a thing about the relativities between how generous the pension is for a single person and a couple that our research suggests might want to be looked at. And that's maybe part of a wider thing that might feed into this new Commission on Taxation and Welfare that has been announced in the programme for government, that really the relativities that we set for across the welfare system in terms of how do we support single people, how do we support those with an adult dependent, how do we support those with a child dependent, maybe it's time to relook at those again and think about how they interact with each other and also with the kind of the system of work, because maybe perhaps they were set at a time when the levels that they were set at, the relativities were appropriate, but things have changed now, and maybe particularly with the rise of housing costs and for if you don't have a home, that there might be need to look again at precisely how well targeted those kind of components of the system are.
Okay, so let's have a look at some of the questions that have come in. And again, I should encourage people to submit questions through the Q&A function. So the first question from Roshan Sin, and it's about the representativeness of the data. So I'll just read it. So how do you think the TILDA data, how representative do you think it is in the current context? So for example, are a current 60 to 65-year-olds representative of those impacted by lower growth rates and the reduction in defined benefit pension? So, and I might give that to you to maybe to describe overall what TILDA is and the specific issue then of how representative is it?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and I think it's getting at two slightly related issues. So the first I suppose is, given TILDA is a sample of the population aged over 50, how representative is it of the population aged over 50? And I suppose it's important to say that when the data that we're looking at here, we take people when they first entered the TILDA survey. So at that point in time, they're representative of that age group. So the 60 to 65s that we're looking at, they're representative of the full population of those aged 60 to 65. But I suppose the more important issue that you're getting at with that question is how, I suppose, that given our findings, what can we say about future cohorts of the population that are coming through and that will be facing retirement over the coming decades? And I think it's fair to say that this cohort is unusual when you look at these sort of intergenerational issues. So you look at, for example, in relation to pension coverage, this group, they're much more likely to be covered by occupational pensions and much more likely to be covered by defined benefit pensions than younger cohorts of the population. There's also big stark differences in relation to, for example, ownership, home ownership. So there's really interesting data from the census, for example, that looks at the age at which 2/3 of your age cohort own your own home, either that's with or without a mortgage. In 1991, that was the age of 28. By 2016, that had gone up to 41. So you can see with those sorts of figures that the group that we're looking at here, the 60 to 65s, they're not representative of the younger cohorts coming through. So one piece of work which we're going to start later this year actually is trying to incorporate the potential impact of much larger housing costs for future cohorts of the population and how that's going to impact on their retirement preparedness. So people are, potentially going to have higher levels of debt going into retirement, and or, for people who are not on the, not owning homes at all, they're going to have rent costs and other housing costs throughout their retirement, which this cohort that we're looking at do not have.
Do you want to add to that at all, Barra, or is that sufficient?
No, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. In particular, the declining home ownership levels really do pose a big issue for our entire pension system. Is kind of structured around the notion that you will have your house owned and paid off, and if that's not going to be the case, it's not an issue imminent in the next 5 years, but it is in the coming decades, and that's something that we're really going to have to look at. How do we reshape the system to account for?
Yeah, actually, it's great to hear that you're going to conduct a study looking at that, because I think a lot of the pension-related discussions we've been having in the Institute recently, this issue continually comes up about the changed nature of home ownership, the point of their lives at which people are actually buying a home, and also the rise in sort of 30, 35-year mortgages and stuff like that. So again, a very, very different landscape. Okay, another question actually from Rushin, and it's the question is, I think a lot of the analysis is done looking at earnings, but did you look at sort of pre-retirement income as opposed to earnings, and does it make a difference?
Yeah, so we did. So I think if I understand the question correctly, so when we looked at the replacement rates, we had 3 benchmarks. So one was based on previous earnings, and it took the sort of broad policy target of at least 50%. And then the other 2 were based on sort of broad sort of rules of thumb that you see in the international literature, which are replacing at least 2/3 of previous sort of household income, and then at least 80%. So it's a higher benchmark. But I think what Roisin is getting at in the question is whether we also looked at replacing at least 50% of household income and compared that with the 50% of earnings. So we did do it, and there is a graph in the report that does it and that shows the cutoff. So I think it was around 40%, but I have to be corrected on that. So there is, I think it's in chapter 4, at the beginning of chapter 4, Roisin, if you want to look at that. That comparison.
Okay. Want to just another question here, and again, let me just read it. So do you have a sense of the scale of inadequacy for those living alone? How prevalent is it, and what is driving this inadequacy? Okay, so I guess this is very much focusing on that issue about the challenges facing people living alone, and then asking, due to housing costs, is the living alone allowance the most appropriate policy response? So that's a blend. I suppose it is almost trying to tease out, well, what is it about the living alone group that they have particular challenges, and then what might be the best policy response?
Okay, I'll make a start maybe. So I think one of the big issues with this living alone group, so I think, well, actually there's 2 parts to the question. One, I suppose, is asking about sort of the depth of, income poverty among this group. And I'm not sure we totally looked at that. But the other is what explains why, this group are estimated as inadequate across all of the measures that we look at. And if you look at their situation at the age of 50, between 50 and 55, which is when we looked at their working life, their income and their assets, they're much less likely to be in employment at the age of 50, between the ages of 50 and 55. So I suppose that's a real indicator there, I suppose, of why then they're subsequently ill prepared then in retirement. Potentially weak attachment to the labour force. They haven't had an opportunity to build up an earnings history, which would allow them to accumulate assets, but more importantly, would allow them to generate occupational pension income in retirement. So I think that's probably the main issue here, is that weak attachment to the labour force right through their working life. But it's not something that we really focused on. It's potentially something that we could look in a bit more detail, as why exactly this group are so disadvantaged across all of the measures that we look at.
Yeah, so I think that links in maybe, Alan, into something that in other work that I've done that we put out earlier this year, that really one area where Ireland stands out, and it does contribute to the high levels of income inequality that you see in terms of market income before tax and benefits in Ireland, is that we have, by European standards, quite a high proportion of single adults living alone who don't have any form of market income. So we're up there as, I think, like the second or third highest in the EU on that, with about 20 I think about more than 20% of single adults living alone of working age who don't have any market income. And so, given they don't have that market income, they don't, as Anne says, build up that occupational pension income or quite as much entitlement to pension in retirement. And so that's one of the big things that's going on. And at the moment, I don't think I'm not sure we looked at housing costs and how they differ between those living alone and if there's going to be a focus on targeting supports in the years ahead, in terms of the state pension, and there isn't scope to maybe increase the main rate, that living alone increase might be well targeted towards a group who happen through to circumstances of their life before then not be in as good a position.
Just staying with the living alone issue, there is a question: is there a gender dimension in living alone finding?
So this was living alone as defined at the age between 50 and 55. So it's probably not as much of an issue if you think sort of later on when women are much more likely to be living alone. There was a bit of a gender dimension in relation to the contrast between the replacement rate results and the income poverty rate results, in that women were much less likely to be defined as inadequate on the basis of the replacement measures, but that's purely a function of the design of these measures. They had low income before retirement, so it's less of a hurdle to replace that, but there's no difference in terms of income poverty.
Okay, if we go back on the housing issue, Brendan O'Dowd has put in a question. Now, actually, the first part of the question, it's on this issue, if you think in terms of people being homeowners, even if they still have mortgage. I suppose that they do have value in the house. There is an asset. And then the question is, when you looked at the annuitized income, were you looking at people who had paid off all of their mortgage and were fully owners, or did you account, say, for somebody who has paid off 60, 70% of the mortgage? How was that wealth?
Yeah. So as far as I recall, we have a measure essentially of, so for financial assets, we take the net position. Okay. Yeah. From what I recall, we don't have information on whether the mortgage is fully paid off, but we do think that most people have at that age for this cohort.
I think we did know the outstanding value of the mortgage, but it was really low.
Yeah, exactly.
So
okay,
it just made no difference to the results. Yeah. Okay,
so just moving on, and the second part of Brendan's point, though, it's this issue that maybe it's really when it comes to the home costs dimension, it's probably non-homeowners. It's really, I guess, the renters are the real issue, which leads on to the question then: was there an urban-rural division here? So, in terms of the analysis, if you're retiring as a renter in an urban area, are you much more likely to be facing whatever constraints?
Yeah, so I suppose so. Nothing came up in terms of of the where rural area really did come up was from the point of view of that those living in rural area were more likely to have financial assets that were typically related to the farm, and so they they came up as not having as much of a risk of having an adequate income in retirement as those in urban areas. I think one thing that's maybe quite important for this age group in particular is, if you're in local authority housing in an urban area, you're not going to have very high rents, and you're going to be positioned. So I don't think it's an issue of just kind of urban, rural. It's really an issue of, are you in the private rental market in an urban area? And that's really where the private rental market is, I suppose, when you retire. And again, for this group, that's not a high, it's not a very high proportion, but as we've been saying throughout, it is going to be a larger proportion. And that's going to be increasingly something for policy to deal with. And how do you deal with that exactly?
Okay. Alan Flynn has just noted that the living alone allowance was increased in budget 2020, went up by, so that maybe that was somebody anticipating the research or whatever like that, and having the policy prescription in advance. And another question from Brendan Little, have you modelled the impact COVID will have on income and assets in the various bands? I'm guessing the answer is possibly not.
No, but obviously you do, naturally think what might the implications be. So I suppose the first is in terms of, I think, the intergenerational inequities in relation to, I suppose, the economic impact of COVID. And I think Barra's spoken about this previously. There's obviously much higher rates of unemployment in younger age groups. And I suppose the longer this goes on, potential scarring impacts of people entering the labour force, and how that affects their trajectory then right through their working life. But I suppose for this particular cohort that we're looking at, and for people that are approaching retirement age, as Barra said at the start of the presentation, lower growth, we're in a really low interest rate environment at the moment. That obviously will have impacts on people's asset values, the potential annuity rates that they're able to get as well. So, will impact, but it's not something we've modelled formally.
Okay, so we're coming sort of towards the end of this, but I just wanted to throw in another question before we do go. And I suppose I'm struck in the presentation that, there's so many possible, benchmarks to measure policy success, and again, definitions of income and all these sort of things. And, one of the issues that always comes across in pensions policy is how complicated it all can be. And it strikes me that if you were to try from a policy-making perspective to tackle every sort of kink and difficulty and everything like that, you could end up with a fiendishly complicated system. And then you with all sorts of possible unintended consequences. And I think our British counterparts have sort of, experimented with a lot and discovered that the outcomes were not always what you were looking for. So to go back to sort of what I was talking about earlier on, I mean, can you still make the argument that really, ideally, pension policy should be simple? It should be the basic anti-poverty measure, flat rate type payment from the state, combined with, be it incentives or whatever, or maybe auto-enrollment, to achieve some sort of greater degree of coverage. And that really policy should be relatively simple and should assist people to the extent that they can. And then beyond a certain point, it's really up to individuals to make the sort of choices that you touched on, Barra. Do you want to forego income during your working years to put into your pension, or do you want to make a different sort of choice? So is there a danger of over complexity?
Yeah, I'm going on that first. So I think that's right. I think really where the state can provide most value and most support is there by providing that consumption floor, and by ensuring that consumption floor is large enough that people are do have sufficient resources in retirement not to be in poverty. And that's kind of the general approach that we've seen over recent years. And why we do see that the pensioner population has much lower rates of poverty than the working age, and in particular the child population. So I think in general that's the right way to go. In terms of, but I think there is maybe a fiendishly complex discussion to have around how exactly we do provide the support for the latter bit that you talk about, for the kind of the additional resources. Because at the moment, there's lots of areas where you can look at and you can see that maybe we're not doing this in the most targeted way. So for example, you know, the level that we set the tax-free lump sum is very, very high. And there's, you know, I think you can ask questions about, well, why is it set so high? What's the public policy rationale in having that set so high? Again, something we highlight in the paper is that given that we show that financial assets are very important for lots of people, that people do have them and that they could provide a higher standard of living, why is it that the capital gains tax system encourages people to hold on to them until they die by not charging any capital gains tax on assets that are transferred at deaths? So I think there's lots of things that you can look around in that area, but the general principle that you say of keep it simple and have a flat rate pension that keeps people out of poverty, and then the other bit up to people, I think is broadly the right approach.
And Anne, I'm going to give you the last word, but I'm going to add an additional consideration, and this is partly I'm asking you this because of your broader interest in health-related matters. But it seems to me that one of the big issues facing older people is not actually the level of income or the replacement rate. It's concerns around income security. And more so expenditure security, meaning if something catastrophic happens to you. And I know everybody always gives the example of nursing home care, but I think it's also the case, you know, if there are major expenditures that arise and people do not have accumulated savings, you know, those are real difficulties. So it's really about security type issues rather than the level. And so I don't know if you want to sort of touch on that broader question then of pensions policies and really what we should be trying to achieve. And is it the case that we certainly should be, you know, paying as much and if not more attention to issues around, you know, the cost of long-term care?
Yeah, so I think one of the issues around security, I think, and I think some of the, you know, I think some of the policy discussion has been trying to grapple with this, is around people's reluctance to buy annuities. So when they, you know, when they get their pension lump sum on retirement, the amount of people who actually buy an annuity, which, you know, gives them a guaranteed income until they die, is actually quite low. So I think there's potentially a role for increased use of annuities and giving people that security to know that they'll have that guaranteed income as they age. There's also, I suppose, you know, going back to Barra's point there around capital gains tax, you know, obviously there's the design of that tax system, but there's also, I suppose, you know, reluctance on people's part as well to liquidate those assets because they are potentially worried about, you know, long-term care costs or other health or economic shocks that are going to hit them later in life. So I think, you know, there's probably a bit of work to be done in terms of ensuring that people, I suppose, are aware of potentially pension products that will give them that security as they age.
Okay, thanks for that. Listen, I think it's probably time to draw things to a close now. So I just want to thank Anne and Barra for the presentation, of course, of the paper. And there was an additional author, Keelan Byrne, worked on this as well. And we'd just like to thank Keelan. So, sorry, Barry, you were going to say something there?
Yeah, and just as well to thank Sana Nivakoska, our former colleague here at the Institute, who helped out on the report at the initial stages while she was at the Institute.
Very good. Thanks for mentioning that as well. So anyway, to everybody who logged on, clearly there's good interest out there in these topics. And as Anne flagged, I think in one of her responses, obviously there will be more work on these issues coming down the line. So excuse me, hopefully we'll all be talking again soon because so many issues, and anyway, they're not going away. Let's put it like that. So with that, I'll say goodbye to you all and thanks again. Bye-bye.